There is something the people of Colton, Wyoming never quite understood. On the morning of October the 3rd, 1889, two people walked side by side down the main street of town and pushed open the door of First Territorial Bank. A woman in a gray traveling dress, dust still on her hem. A man with a gray beard and a slight drag in his left leg, shoulders wide enough to fill a doorframe. They did not rush. They did not look around to see who was watching. They walked like people who had already decided something and were simply gonna finish it. And the one person in Colton who understood exactly what that meant was standing in the window of that same bank, watching them come. Edmund Frey did not move when he saw them. He stood with his hands behind his back, his coat pressed, his face arranged into something that was not quite calm and not quite fear. He watched the woman and the man cross the street, and he did not step back from the glass. He did not call for anyone. He did not reach for the bell on his desk. He only watched. People who saw him there said later that he looked like a man waiting for something he had known was coming for a long time. Not surprised, not angry, just waiting for the last piece of a thing to fall into place. What no one in Colton knew, what no one would fully understand until much later, was that Edmund Frey had known this moment was possible from the very first day Cecily Vane stepped off the westbound train. He had known it before Harlow Briggs drove his wagon down to the station to meet her. He had known it before either of them had spoken a single word to each other. He had known it because he was the one who had made it possible. That is where this story begins. Not on the morning of October the 3rd, but 3 months earlier on a Tuesday in early July, when the summer heat had already baked the hills around Colton, the color of old straw, and a woman no one had ever seen before climbed down from a train with one small leather bag and looked at the town the way a person looks at a map. They are not entirely sure they read correctly. Colton was not a big town. It sat in a shallow valley between two low ridges in the southeastern corner of Wyoming territory, close enough to the Nebraska line that on clear days you could almost believe the land flattened out into something kinder, just beyond the next hill. It had one main street, one church, one bank, one dry goods store, a livery, a post office, and a boarding house run by a woman named Nora Hendry, who had been a widow for 11 years and had no intention of remarrying and made that clear to anyone who considered asking. The surrounding country was open range country, cattle country, the kind of land that rewarded people who did not need much comfort and punished people who did. The winters came early and stayed long. The summers were short and bright and over before you had properly appreciated them. The most important man in Colton was not the sheriff, a tired old fellow named Aldous Reeve who mostly wanted to finish out his years without anything serious happening on his watch. It was not the minister, and it was not Edmund Frey, though Frey would have placed himself second at worst. The most important man in Colton was Harlow Briggs, who ran a cattle operation called Briggs Ranch, 7 miles west of town, who employed 14 men year-round, who had been bailing out neighbors and fixing fences and settling disputes in that valley for better than 20 years, and who did all of this without ever holding a single official position or asking for any recognition whatsoever. He was 49 years old that summer, broad through the shoulders, slow to speak, gray in the beard. He walked with a slight hitch in his left leg from an injury that was 15 years old and had healed wrong, and he had long since stopped noticing it himself. even if other people did. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent his life working thick-scarred, always a little roughened, no matter how recently he had cleaned up. He was not a handsome man in any conventional sense, but there was something in the steadiness of his eyes and the economy of his movements that made people feel in his presence that things were going to be managed. He had lived alone in the main house at Briggs Ranch for 8 years, since the summer of 1881, when his wife Margaret died of typhoid fever in the space of 9 days. Too fast for anyone to properly understand what was happening until it was already done. He did not talk about Margaret in ordinary conversation. He did not avoid the subject if it came up directly, but he also did not invite it. The people who knew him well knew that he still kept her chair by the sitting room fire, a wide upholstered armchair she had brought with her from her parents' home in Ohio, and that he had never permitted anyone to sit in it since she died. He had a son, not by blood, a boy named Dex, whom he had taken in at the age of 9 in the year 1874, when Dex's father had died in a saloon fight in Laramie, and there was no mother anyone could locate. Harlow had not known the father well. He had known him well enough to think the boy deserved better than a county home, and that had been sufficient. Dex was 24 now and managed the south half of the ranch with a competence that would have surprised people who did not know Harlow's methods. He was loyal to Harlow in the particular way of young men who understand at some level they cannot always articulate that they owe someone more than can ever be repaid. It made him reliable. It also made him, in certain circumstances, easy to use. The decision to write to a matrimonial agency had been Dex's idea. He had found an advertisement in a newspaper from Philadelphia. He did not explain how he had come across a newspaper from Philadelphia, and he had set it on the kitchen table one evening in March. The advertisement described itself as offering introductions between women of education and good character in the eastern states and honest established men in the western territories. It was carefully worded. It managed to be both businesslike and faintly hopeful at the same time, which was a difficult thing to do in a short paragraph. Harlow had looked at the advertisement for a long time. He had not said anything. He had stood up and gone to bed. In the morning, the advertisement was still on the table. Someone had folded it along a careful crease as if it were a document worth keeping. Cecily Vane had been a schoolteacher in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia for 6 years. She was 27 years old, with dark brown hair and blue eyes that were not warm. Exactly. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to look carefully before deciding anything. She stood very straight, not from pride precisely, but from the habit of a woman who had spent years in front of rooms full of children and understood that how you carried yourself was the first thing people read. She had been good at her work. Her students had generally learned what she taught them. The parents of her students had generally respected her, which was a more complicated achievement, given that she was unmarried and had no family name that meant anything in Philadelphia society. Then the school had lost its principal funding. Then her landlord had raised the rent. Then her aunt, the only family she had left in the city, had sold her house and moved to Boston to live with her daughter. These things had not happened all at once. They had happened over the course of 18 months, each one manageable by itself, each one a little less manageable in combination with the ones that came before. There was also the matter of the Hargreave family, which she did not discuss with anyone. and which had nonetheless been discussed about her in certain circles of Germantown society. Thomas Hargreave was the son of her aunt's neighbor. He was 22 years old and had money and bad judgment, and he had made her a proposal in December of 1888 that she had refused in terms she had tried to keep polite. He had not taken the refusal with any particular grace. He was the kind of young man who mistook wealth for correctness, and the kind of family that backed him even when he was not correct. By February of 1889, Cecily Vane had concluded that Philadelphia no longer held a future she could build. She was practical about it. She did not romanticize her circumstances or her options. She filled out the paperwork for the matrimonial agency and wrote a letter that described herself: honestly, educated, capable, unafraid of physical work, in good health, without explaining the particular chain of events that had made the letter necessary. She was not lying. She was simply presenting facts in the order that was useful. She received 3 responses. 2 she ruled out after the first exchange of letters. 1 she read 3 times. The letter from Wyoming was short. It said the ranch was large, and the work was steady, and the winters were long. It said the writer was not a young man, and was not going to pretend otherwise. It said that if she could accept those things, he would accept whatever came with her. She had sat with that letter for 2 days before writing back. It was the phrase, "whatever came with her," that decided her. She was not sure the man who wrote it understood how much he had offered in those 4 words, but she was willing to find out. She sold her mother's silver ring to cover the difference in her train fare. She packed everything she owned into 1 leather bag. She did not look at Philadelphia from the train window when it left the station. The train arrived in Colton on a Tuesday afternoon in early July, when the sky was the particular shade of blue that only exists in high country in summer, and the air smelled of dry grass and something mineral from the ridge. Cecily stepped down from the car onto the platform and took 1 slow look at the town stretched out beyond the station. It was smaller than she had expected, which she had expected it to be. Harlow was standing at the far end of the platform. He had come alone, which she would later learn was characteristic. He did not bring witnesses to things that did not require them. He was wearing his good hat and a clean shirt, which she could tell was an effort because the shirt was a little stiff and did not sit quite naturally on him. He recognized her without any particular hesitation. She was the only woman who had gotten off the train who was not looking for someone specific with her eyes. She was looking at the place itself. They stood in front of each other. The gap between them was approximately 3 feet and felt like rather more than that. She said, "Mr. Briggs." He said, "Miss Vane. Welcome." And then, with no ceremony whatsoever, "I've got a horse at the post. Road to the ranch is an hour and a half. I thought we'd stop at the boarding house first if you wanted to clean up." She said, "I'd appreciate that." They walked through Colton side by side, not speaking much. Cecily looked at the buildings, the horses, the quality of the street, the expressions of the people who looked back at them. She cataloged things. It was what she did. About 2/3 of the way down the main street, she noticed a man standing in the window of the building marked First Territorial Bank. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed hair, combed back from a broad forehead. He was watching them with the quality of attention that is not casual, that has a purpose to it even when the face that contains it is arranged to suggest otherwise. She did not know who he was. She did not know why he was watching. She stored the observation without reaching a conclusion about it, the same way she had stored 1,000 things in 6 years of reading rooms full of people who did not always mean what they said. Nora Hendry opened the boarding house door before they reached it. She was a solid woman in her middle 40s with gray coming into her dark hair, and a way of standing in a doorway that made it clear the doorway belonged to her. She looked at Cecily once, top to bottom, not unkindly. Then she looked at Harlow. She said, "Room's ready." And then she held the door wider and stepped aside. Harlow brought in Cecily's bag and left it at the foot of the stairs. Then Nora appeared with her hand on the newel post and said, "Harlow, the horse can use some water. There's a bucket by the side gate." It was not a request. Harlow nodded and went out. Nora led Cecily up the stairs. The room was small and clean with a window facing the back garden and a washstand in the corner. Nora set a pitcher of water on the stand and turned around with her hands folded. She said, "Harlow Briggs is a good man. He's not easy to know and he's not what you'd call demonstrative. But he's honest in a way that's actually rare. You understand the difference I'm making?" Cecily said, "I think so." "Good." Nora moved toward the door. Then she stopped with her hand on the frame. "There are things about Colton I think you ought to learn yourself, rather than hear from me. But there's one thing I'll tell you plain. Edmund Frey, who runs the bank here, he knows more about people's business than people realize. And he uses what he knows. Not always badly, but not always for anyone's benefit but his own. Just keep that in your thinking." She paused. "That's all I'll say." Cecily thanked her. After Nora left, she stood at the window and looked out at the back garden, a square of tended earth with late summer vegetables, and a row of sunflowers that were beginning to bow under their own weight. She thought about the man in the bank window. She thought about the phrase, "whatever came with her." She thought about Philadelphia. And then she stopped thinking about Philadelphia because there was no practical use in it. They ate that evening in the boarding house dining room. It was a plain room with 4 tables and kerosene lamps and a smell of whatever Nora had been cooking since mid-morning. Harlow and Cecily sat at the corner table. Dex arrived 20 minutes late, hat in hand, with the expression of a young man trying to appear more relaxed than he felt. He was tall and fair-haired and shook Cecily's hand with the earnest awkwardness of someone performing a gesture they had rehearsed in their head. They had been at the table perhaps 40 minutes when the front door opened and Edmund Frey came in. He was not loud about it. He came in quietly, nodded at Nora, who was passing with a coffee pot, and moved toward the table with the air of a man who visited on Tuesdays and saw no reason tonight should be different. He was perhaps 52, with a face that was controlled rather than handsome. Everything placed correctly, nothing excessive. He wore a good coat and his boots were clean despite the dust of the street. "Harlow," he said and shook hands. Then Dex. And then he turned to Cecily with a smile that was exactly as warm as the situation seemed to require, and not 1 degree warmer. "Miss Vane, I'm Edmund Frey. I run First Territorial Bank here in Colton. Welcome to town." She shook his hand. His grip was brief and dry. "Thank you, Mr. Frey." He sat down with them, not at their table, but at the adjacent one, close enough that conversation was natural. He talked mostly with Harlow. Cattle prices. The question of the North County road, which had been graded badly 2 seasons ago and had not been repaired. a contract for grazing rights that someone in the county seat was apparently making complicated. He spoke about these things comfortably and knowledgeably, which suggested he kept close attention on matters that were technically outside his direct business. Cecily ate and listened. She participated in the conversation when it invited her, and was quiet when it did not. Every 4 or 5 minutes she became aware of Frey's eyes on her. Not the way a man looks at a woman he finds attractive. Not that kind. The way a man looks at a situation he is still calculating. As if she were an element that had entered a problem he had been working on, and he was determining how she changed the variables. When Frey left about an hour later, he shook hands all around and wished them a good evening, and walked out into the dark street with the manner of a man who had accomplished what he came for, even if nothing specific had been accomplished. That was visible to anyone watching. Dex leaned back in his chair and said, "He always does that. Just shows up." Harlow said, "He always has a reason." And then he picked up his coffee and did not say anything else. Nora refilled the cups without being asked. On her way back to the kitchen, she paused at the window and looked out at the street where Frey had gone. And what crossed her face in that moment was not worry exactly. It was the expression of someone doing a calculation of their own. The road to Briggs Ranch the following morning was exactly as Harlow had described, an hour and a half unpaved, running through open grassland that became rockier and more interesting as it climbed toward the western ridge. Cecily sat on the wagon bench beside Harlow. The bag was in the back. The sky was already warm. They did not talk much on the road. This was not uncomfortable. Cecily had spent enough time in the company of other people to understand the difference between a silence that was awkward and a silence that was simply two people being in the same place without needing to fill it. This was the second kind. At some point she said, "You walk with a drag in your left leg." He was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that yesterday." Day before, technically. The platform. He considered this without apparent offense. Horse rolled on me in 74. Leg didn't set right. It's been long enough that I don't notice it much. Does it hurt? Some days more than others. He looked at the road. Nothing useful to say about it. She nodded. She could respect that. There were plenty of things she carried that there was nothing useful to say about. The ranch came into view from the top of a low rise. The main house first larger than she had expected. Then the outbuildings spreading out on either side the corral, the bunkhouse, the long shed along the eastern fence line. The grassland around it was good grass green, where the creek ran through, and golden brown, where the high ground dried early. She had not grown up in farming country, but she could look at a piece of land and tell the difference between land that worked and land that was worked out. This land worked. The house itself was solid and plain good timber. A sound roof, a porch that ran the full width of the front, and had evidently been added on after the original building, because the wood did not quite match. Inside, it was clean in the way of a place that one person has maintained with effort rather than the natural efficiency that comes from two. The furniture was practical. The floors were swept. There were no curtains on the kitchen windows, but the windows were clean. Cecily walked through to the sitting room. The first thing she noticed was the armchair by the fireplace. It was older than anything else in the room. The fabric at the arms was beginning to wear through, and the cushion had settled into the permanent impression of someone who had sat in the same position many times over many years. There was a small book on the seat, not being read, just resting there as if someone had set it down and intended to return. She looked at it and said nothing. The question of Margaret Briggs was not one she needed to ask or have answered on the second day. In the first week, she learned the rhythms of the place. She learned that Harlow was in the fields by first light, and that if she had coffee ready when he came in at mid-morning, he accepted it without much comment, but without missing it on the days it was there. She learned that Dex took his direction better when it was specific. Tell him exactly what needed doing, and he did it well. Leave it general, and he would find the most comfortable interpretation. She learned that the cook, an older man named Ferris, who came in from the bunkhouse to manage the big kitchen 3 days a week, was not interested in conversation before 9 in the morning and was entertaining company after noon. She learned the land, the north field where the creek bent and made a wide flat meadow that flooded in spring and dried beautifully by July. The south pasture where the grass ran long against the fence and the cattle preferred it. The back 40 where the ground got rocky and the fence posts needed checking every season. And somewhere beyond the north meadow past the stand of cottonwoods that marked the boundary, the place where the property ended, and the land that had belonged to a man named Caldwell began, or had begun. The Caldwell place had been empty for 2 years now. Nobody talked about why with any specificity. On the 6th day, late in the afternoon, a man rode in from the East Road. She was on the porch and she saw him coming before anyone else did. He was riding a dun horse and sitting badly with the loose posture of someone who had once ridden a great deal and had long since stopped. She did not know his face. Harlow came around this corner of the house from the side yard, and when he saw the rider, he stopped moving in a way that was not quite stillness. It was the particular quality of a large man who has made himself go very still, because the alternative is something he is not yet prepared to do. The rider pulled up at the edge of the yard. He was perhaps 40, weathered and thin, with a jaw that had been hit recently enough that the bruising was still yellow-green along one side. "Briggs," he said. "Garth Neal, you know who I am." "I know who you are," Harlow said. "What do you want?" "I want the month's wages you held back when you turned me out. I come to collect. There were no wages held back. You took something that wasn't yours, and I let you leave instead of letting you take what was coming to you for it. That's the whole of what happened. Go." Garth Neal did not go immediately. He sat on his horse and looked at the house, at the porch, at Cecily standing there. His eyes went over her with the absent appraisal of a man taking stock of new information. Then something moved in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor of one, the expression a person makes when they have just thought of something they believe gives them an advantage. "Didn't know you'd found yourself someone new," he said. "Frey know about her." Harlow came down the porch steps. 1 step, that was all. Neal read it correctly. He turned his horse and rode back down the East Road without saying anything else. Harlow stood at the bottom of the steps for a long moment after the sound of hooves had gone. He did not turn around right away. When he did, his face had the quality of a man who has heard something that has clarified a concern he was already carrying but had not yet named. Cecily said, "Who is he?" "Nobody," Harlow said. "A man I fired for stealing." He came back up the steps. Don't put any weight on what he said. He went inside. She heard him go through the kitchen and then the sound of the back door. She stayed on the porch. The evening was coming down across the ridge in shades of orange and dark red, and the last of the summer heat was lifting off the land in the slow, gentle way it did some evenings. It was beautiful, in a way that did not particularly care whether anyone was looking. She was thinking about Frey know about her. She was thinking about why that question said in that tone on a ranch in the middle of Wyoming territory would make Harlow Briggs take a single step down from his own porch and make a man who had come looking for trouble decide without further argument to leave. She did not have an answer yet, but she had learned in 27 years that the questions that move people that way were always worth understanding. She went inside as the last of the light went off the hills and began thinking about what she did not yet know. The answer arrived in pieces the way most answers do. The first piece came from Nora Hendry on a Wednesday afternoon 2 weeks after Cecily had settled into the ranch. Cecily had driven into town alone for thread and writing paper, which she needed, and for conversation that was not about cattle or fencing, which she also needed. Nora was in the back garden when Cecily came around the side of the house, deadheading the sunflowers that had finished their season and gone papery at the edges. Nora did not look up from the flowers. "Staying or going," she said. "I haven't decided yet," Cecily said, which was mostly true. Nora snipped a dead head off cleanly and dropped it in the basket at her feet. "That's an honest answer. Most women who come out here either decide in the first 3 days that they hate it or decide in the first 3 days that they can manage it. You're still watching." "I'm always still watching," Cecily said. Nora looked up then. She had a way of looking at a person that was not unkind but was thorough. "Come in and have something cold." They sat at the kitchen table with 2 glasses of water and the particular ease of women who have established without saying so directly that they are going to speak plainly with each other. Nora asked about the ranch, about Dex, about whether Harlow was being decent. Cecily answered honestly on all counts. Harlow was being decent. He was also being reserved in a way that was not quite reserved, more like a man who was waiting to see how something turned out before he committed to anything which she understood but found wearing. "He lost a great deal when Margaret died," Nora said. "Not just her. Himself a little. The version of himself that trusted things to hold." Cecily turned her glass on the table. "Do you think he'll come back to that?" "I think he already has more than he knows. The question is whether he knows it fast enough." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something plain?" "Yes." "Is there anything about how you came here that would look different to someone who wanted it to look different?" Cecily was still for a beat. Then she set her glass down. "Why do you ask it that way?" "Because Edmund Frey asked me last week how well I knew you." Nora folded her hands on the table. "He doesn't ask questions like that without a reason, and his reasons are generally not the same as the reasons he offers." Cecily looked out of the kitchen window at the street. A man was loading a cart in front of the dry goods store. 2 horses stood at the rail in front of the saloon patient, and motionless in the heat. Colton in the middle of the afternoon was as quiet as a place gets, without being entirely dead. She said, "I left Philadelphia under circumstances that someone could tell badly if they wanted to tell them badly. Someone did something to you. Or you did something yourself. Someone did something. I refused it. He had money and I had a teaching position that depended on people's goodwill, and the intersection of those two facts was not in my favor. She looked back at Nora. I did nothing wrong. I am also aware that doing nothing wrong is not always sufficient protection. Nora nodded slowly. She did not look surprised or pitying, which were the two responses Cecily had most dreaded. She looked like a woman taking in information that she intended to use carefully. Harlow needs to know, Nora said. I know. Not because he has a right to know, but because if Frey knows before Harlow does, it will come to Harlow shaped like something it isn't. And Harlow is the kind of man who doesn't ask questions once he's decided something. He just gets quiet. She paused. He gets very quiet, and then eventually he does something that costs him more than if he'd just asked the question at the start. Cecily said, "When did you know about Frey?" 11 years is a long time to run a boarding house in a small town, Nora said. You learn who the town is afraid of and who the town respects, and why those two lists are almost never the same. She stood and took their glasses to the sink. I'll tell you something else. Frey came to Colton 12 years ago with enough money to open a bank, and the kind of records that people don't look at too hard when someone is offering them credit. His loan book is not a thing you'd want examined by someone with time and patience. He knows this. It's why he handles certain situations without involving anyone from the county seat. He can't afford the attention. Cecily absorbed this. He can't push Harlow through the courts. He can't push anyone through the courts. Nora turned from the sink. Which means when Frey wants something, he finds another way. He usually finds several ways at once and sees which one opens a door first. Harlow found the survey stakes on a Thursday. He had gone out to the north boundary alone, which he did at the end of each month. A habit from the years when the Caldwell property had been active, and there had been periodic questions about where one operation ended and the other began. The stakes were not on his land. They were on the Caldwell ground 10 yards past the cottonwood line set in a fresh turn row, pointing south toward the creek. The wood was pale and new. The paint on the heads was red, which was what the county surveyor used when he was working a private contract. Harlow stood in the grass and looked at them for a long time. Someone had paid for a survey of the Caldwell property. Someone who wanted to know exactly where the boundaries ran and exactly where the creek crossed those boundaries and exactly how the water rights would be described in a deed. He walked the row of stakes from end to end counting. 12 in total, which was more than you needed for a simple boundary check. This was a full assessment. This was someone preparing to make a claim. He had not authorized it. The Caldwell estate, such as it was still technically in the hands of the county pending the settlement of the old man's debts. Those debts included, among others, the amount Caldwell had owed Harlow. When he died, a sum that Harlow had lent him 3 years ago to keep the property from being sold out from under him, secured by a written agreement that Harlow had in a drawer in his desk and had not yet had cause to present to anyone. That agreement said in plain language that in the event of Caldwell's death before repayment, the north portion of his property, the portion with the creek frontage, would pass to Harlow Briggs as settlement of the debt. It had been witnessed by 2 people. It had not been filed with the county because, at the time, Harlow had not wanted to embarrass Caldwell with a public record of what had passed between them. And Caldwell had asked him with the dignity of a man who still had some left not to make it official until it was necessary. It had not been necessary until now. Harlow pulled one stake from the ground and turned it in his hands. The wood was dry pine cut recently enough that you could still smell the sap. He pressed his thumb against the red paint on the head. It was fully dry. This had been done at least 3 days ago, maybe 5. He looked south toward the town across the open grass. The angle of the afternoon light made the valley floor look peaceful, all gold and soft shadow, as if nothing in it were sharp or contested. He had lived in this valley for 22 years. He had watched it change and stay the same in equal measure. He understood it the way you understand a place when you have committed your life to it without reservation. He had not committed to this place in order to lose the North Creek, not because of the water, though the water mattered, because of what the North Creek meant for the woman who was living in the small cabin at the edge of those cottonwoods in the old Caldwell storage house, who had been there for 4 years, and whom Harlow had told when her husband died in a fence accident on his own land that she could stay as long as she needed to. Her name was Eula. She was 61 years old, thick-handed and gray, and she grew a kitchen garden behind the storage house and kept 2 chickens and asked for nothing from anyone. Harlow brought supplies out to her twice a month. He had given her his own name to use because she had no one left, and a name was something. She called him Mr. Briggs, and he told her she could call him Harlow, and she never did. If someone bought that land, if someone bought it and chose to exercise what any buyer would legally be entitled to, Eula would have nowhere to go. Harlow walked back to his horse. He did not replace the stake he had pulled. He took it with him, tied it across the back of his saddle, and rode home at the kind of measured pace a man uses when he is thinking hard and does not want the thinking interrupted. He did not go to Cecily when he got back. He went to his desk and found the agreement with Caldwell and read it twice through carefully, the way he had not read it in 2 years because he had not needed to. Then he sat for a while with his hands on the desk and looked at the wall. He was beginning to see the shape of something. He did not have all the pieces yet, but he could feel the outline the way you feel the edge of a table in the dark. Before your eyes adjust, present solid more than you want to run into. He thought about the survey stakes. He thought about Garth Neal's question in the yard. He thought about the direction both of those things pointed, which was the same direction, and that direction was the bank on the main street of Colton. He went about the rest of the day's work without saying anything to anyone. That evening, Cecily was at the kitchen table when he came through. She was reading a book she had brought from Philadelphia, the spine worn from previous readings. He came in to get water from the pitcher and stopped when he saw the cover. "What is that?" he said. She looked up, which she did with the slight readiness of someone who had learned not to be startled. "Dickens, Great Expectations. 3rd time through." He poured his water. "What do you still find in it?" She considered the question with the seriousness it seemed to deserve. "The first time I read it, I thought about Pip. The second time, I thought about Miss Havisham. This time, I keep thinking about Magwitch." "Who is Magwitch?" "A man who does something terrible and spends his whole life trying to make it right, and almost does and dies not entirely knowing whether he succeeded." She closed the book over her thumb. "He's not a good man, but he's an honest one eventually." Harlow looked at the book, then at her. He nodded once in the way of someone storing something rather than responding to it. Then he took his water and went back down the hall. Cecily listened to his footsteps until they stopped. Then she opened her book again, but she did not read. She stared at the page, and thought about the fact that he had asked a genuine question and listened to a genuine answer, and that this had not happened in 4 or 5 days. She thought about what Nora had said about Harlow getting quiet. She thought about how the quiet had come on gradually enough that she had not noticed it starting, only its accumulated weight. She thought about what she still had not told him. She decided that tomorrow she would tell him, whatever it cost. She did not get the chance. The next morning, a letter arrived. Harlow was in the barn when Dex brought it in from town. He almost left it until evening, but something about the way it had been addressed, his name in a careful, impersonal hand. No return name, no return address, made him open it in the barn while the horses moved in their stalls around him. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it was what appeared to be a clipping from a newspaper, or a copy of one handwritten as if transcribed from a printed source. It described a situation at a girls' academy in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia. It described an unnamed woman of the teaching faculty who had been at the center of a social controversy involving a prominent local family. The language was circumspect. It was written in the way of a publication that had been very careful about what it could be accused of stating directly, but its meaning was not. The unnamed woman had done something that had required the family in question to respond. The academy had quietly declined to renew certain contracts. There had been talk. The article, if that was what it was, did not name Cecily Vane. But Harlow had received one letter from one woman from Philadelphia, and the letter had described a schoolteacher, and the piece of paper in his hands described a schoolteacher, and the conjunction was not one he could set aside. He put the paper in his coat pocket. He went about the day's work. He did it with the mechanical competence of a man who has been doing physical labor for 30 years and does not need to think about it in order to do it correctly, which freed his mind to work on something else entirely. The question he kept returning to was not whether Cecily was the woman in the clipping. It was who had wanted him to know about her, and how that person had known what to send and why now. 3 questions that kept pointing the same direction as the survey stakes and Garth Neal's parting words. He ate supper that evening with less appetite than usual, and spoke less than usual, which was already not a great deal. Cecily asked once quietly whether something had happened at the ranch. He said he was tired. It was not a lie, and it was not the truth, and it sat in the air between them like something with weight. After supper, she went to her room. He sat by the cold fireplace for a while in his own chair and looked across at Margaret's. The book was still on the seat of it, where it always was, where it had been for 8 years. He had not put it there. Margaret had put it there the morning she first felt ill, and he had not touched it since. He thought about a woman who read Dickens for the 3rd time, because she was still finding things in it. He thought about whatever came with her. He thought about how he had written those words on a clear winter evening in March in his own kitchen, with the careful deliberateness of a man who was not naturally given to grand statements, but had wanted to make one that was true. And then he thought about Edmund Frey and the survey stakes and Garth Neal saying Frey know about her, and the letter in his coat pocket with no return address. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. Dex came to town on a Friday to settle an account at the dry goods store. He went to the bank first to withdraw the cash from the ranch account, which was routine, and Edmund Frey happened to come out of his office while Dex was at the teller's window, and happened to ask how things were going at the ranch, which was also routine, and so Dex ended up sitting in the office for 20 minutes with a cup of coffee because that was the natural continuation of the conversation, and there was nothing in it that seemed to require suspicion. Frey asked about the cattle, about the fence repairs on the south pasture, about whether Harlow was thinking of expanding the herd before winter or holding steady. Then, in the same easy conversational tone he had used for everything else, he said, "It's good that Harlow has some company out there now. A man that age running a place that size shouldn't be alone." He paused as if the thought were occurring to him for the first time. "I do hope everything's settled with the arrangement." Dex said, "Seems to be. Good. Good." Frey turned his pen in his fingers, looking at the desk. "I ask because, and this is perhaps more than I should say, I've heard a few things from people back east about the agency Harlow used. Not about the agency itself. About some of the women who've come through it." He looked up with a careful expression of concern. The expression of a man who has reluctant information and is sharing it out of duty rather than pleasure. "I'm sure it's nothing. But I thought, as someone who cares about how things go for Harlow, I ought to mention that some inquiries might be worth making before things become too official." Dex said nothing. "You understand I'm not making any accusations," Frey said. "I'm only saying that a man in Harlow's position, with a debt situation that's somewhat delicate right now, would want to be certain about the character of anyone he was bringing permanently onto that property." He smiled. "I'm sure she's exactly what she seems. I just wouldn't want to see Harlow embarrassed." Dex rode home with the money in his saddlebag, and Frey's words arranged and rearranged in his head the whole 7 miles. He told himself he was not going to say anything. He told himself it was not his business. He told himself Frey was a man who minded other people's affairs too much, and that the best thing to do with what he had said was leave it where it had been said. He came into the kitchen for supper and found Cecily at the stove, and something in the way he looked at her when he said good evening was a degree off from how he had looked at her the day before. Not hostile, not accusatory, just slightly recalibrated, the way a person's eyes change when they are looking at something they are no longer entirely sure of. She noticed. She always noticed. But she did not say anything because she did not have enough yet, and because the day was already full of things she needed to think about. On the 4th day after she had made up her mind, she drove into town. She told herself she was going for writing paper. She walked past the dry goods store and kept walking until she was standing in front of First Territorial Bank. And then she stood there for a moment looking at the sign. She went in. The teller was a young man with spectacles who asked if she had an account. She said she was there to see Mr. Frey. The young man went to knock on the inner office door, and a moment later Frey himself appeared in the doorway, already composed as if he had been expecting her, which she understood now he probably had. "Miss Vane," he said, "come in." The office was small and ordered with a desk that held exactly the items on it that should be there and nothing that shouldn't. There was a painting on the wall behind him, a landscape mountains generic enough to be from anywhere. Frey closed the door and gestured to a chair and poured 2 cups of tea from a pot that was already warm, which confirmed that he had been prepared for this particular visitor on this particular day, or had been prepared for some days, and was simply patient about which one it would be. He sat down behind his desk and looked at her with the measured goodwill of a man who has decided to have an honest conversation and is pleased with this decision. "I'll speak plainly," he said. I generally find it saves time." "So do I," she said. "Good." He settled back slightly. "I know about Germantown, Miss Vane. I knew before you arrived in Colton. I make it my business to understand who is coming into this community and what they bring with them. I have contacts in Philadelphia, people in certain professional circles who keep me informed about persons of interest." He said it plainly, the way a man states a practice he sees nothing wrong with. "You understand that is simply how banking works at a certain level." She said nothing. "I also know about Harlow's debt to this institution. The northern parcel of Briggs Ranch has been held as collateral since 1886, against a loan of some considerable size. Harlow has not been able to reduce the principal in a meaningful way, and the terms of the loan allow me to call it due at 12 months' notice, which I have not yet given." He picked up his cup and held it. "Now, the northern parcel, as you may have gathered, includes the creek frontage. Water rights in this county are not a small matter." She looked at him. "You want the land. I want the creek," he said. "The land is the instrument." "Yes." "Why not simply call the loan?" He set his cup down. For the first time, something moved in his face that was slightly less controlled than what he had shown her so far. A loan call of that size requires county documentation. It requires that the terms of the original agreement be examined along with the terms of all related agreements. He paused. "I have a great deal of money lent out in this county on terms that I would prefer not to be examined in a formal legal proceeding." "I trust that's clear enough." It was clear enough. She thought of what Nora had said. "You learn who the town is afraid of." "So you need a willing seller," she said. "I need Harlow to sell me the north parcel voluntarily at a negotiated price before the question of the debt becomes a matter of public record." He looked at her with the expression of a man making a reasonable business proposition. "You are in a position to help facilitate that. I imagine Harlow trusts your counsel, or will given time. I'm asking you to use that position to help him understand that selling the north parcel is his best option. He keeps the ranch. The debt is retired. No one loses, and the story from Germantown remains in my files," he said, "where it has been and where it would stay." She sat with this for a moment. The light through the single window of his office was the flat, whitish light of midday. She could hear the street outside a horse, someone calling across to someone else. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon in a small town entirely indifferent to what was happening in this room. She said, "And the woman living in the storage house on the north parcel." Something changed in Frey's expression. It was subtle and brief, and then it was gone. But she had been watching for it. He had not expected her to know about Eula. "That's a separate matter," he said. "Is it?" She stood up. "Thank you for the tea, Mr. Frey." "Miss Vane." His voice was still even. "I would encourage you to think carefully about this." "I am thinking carefully," she said. "That's why I'm leaving." She sat in the back garden of Nora's boarding house for the better part of an hour. The garden was at its end-of-season best, the vegetables picked, or going to seed, the sunflowers gone, but the stems still standing, the whole thing having the dignified decline of something that had done its work well and was winding down without complaint. 2 pigeons moved along the top of the back fence unconcerned. Somewhere down the alley, a dog was barking at something that had probably already gone. She had three options, and she knew what they were, and she knew the cost of each. She could do what Frey wanted. Persuade Harlow to sell. Keep her own story off the table. It was not impossible. She might even be able to frame it as protecting him selling the North parcel on favorable terms before the debt situation became worse. He might listen. He might not feel afterward that anything had been done to him, except that Eula would be gone from those cottonwoods in a season, and the creek would belong to a man who had gotten it through extortion, and Cecily Vane would know for the rest of her life which choice she had made when it mattered. She could leave, get on a train and go back east, or go somewhere else entirely. She was not yet legally bound to the arrangement. There had been a letter and a journey and an understanding, but no ceremony, no document. She could disappear from Colton, and Harlow would have one more loss to carry, and Frey would find another method, and Eula would still be in those cottonwoods with the same precariousness as before, but without anyone actively holding the situation together. She could tell Harlow everything, in the order it had happened, and the order it had happened today, and the part she suspected he did not yet know about the stakes in his own north field. This was the option that could cost her the most in the short run, because it required her to put down every shield she had carried since Philadelphia, and trust that what she found on the other side was a man who meant what he had written in March, whatever came with her. She had thought she understood what those words were worth. She was about to find out whether she had been right. Nora came out with a glass of water and set it on the bench beside her, without being asked. Then Nora sat down, which she did not always do, which meant she had something to say. Cecily said, "He's going to hear it badly if someone else tells him first." "Yes," Nora said, "and if I tell him and he doesn't believe me, then you'll know." Nora folded her hands in her lap. "Cecily, you came 1,500 miles to find out what kind of man he was. You might as well finish the trip." The afternoon light lay long and gold across the beaten-down grass of the garden. Somewhere down the street, a screen door banged. A bird was making a late summer sound in the cottonwood beyond the fence, something lazy and unhurried, as if it had no idea that anything in the world was urgent. Cecily picked up the glass and drank. Then she set it down and stood up. "I'll be going back to the ranch," she said. Nora nodded once. She did not say good luck or be careful, or any of the things a person might say. She had said what needed to be said. She understood that the rest of it belonged to somebody else. She did not find the right moment that evening, not because the moment was not there. It was there after supper when Dex had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, and Harlow was sitting at his desk in the small room off the hallway that served as his office. The door half open, the lamp burning low. She stood in the hallway for a full minute. She could see the edge of his shoulder the way he was bent slightly forward over something on the desk. The particular stillness of a man who is not reading but thinking. She went to her room instead. She lay on top of the covers and listened to the ranch settle into night. The distant sounds of cattle, the wind finding the gap in the eave above her window. That it always found the measured creak of the house cooling in the way of old timber that has absorbed the day's heat and is releasing it slowly. She had slept in worse places, and she had slept in places that felt safer. And she lay there measuring the difference until, at some point, she stopped measuring and slept. In the morning, Harlow was already gone when she came to the kitchen. There was coffee on the stove still hot. She poured a cup and stood at the kitchen window and watched the light come up over the eastern ridge in the particular way it came up on clear mornings. Not gradually, but in stages, the color changing 3 or 4 distinct times before it became simply daylight. She heard him before she saw him, the drag of his left boot on the porch boards. The sound she had cataloged on the first day, without knowing yet that it was specific to him. He came through the back door and stopped when he saw her, which lasted only a moment before he moved toward the coffee pot. She said, "I need to tell you something." He said, "All right." He poured his coffee and turned around and leaned against the counter with it, which she understood was his version of sitting down. His version of giving someone his full attention without making a ceremony of it. She told him. She started with Thomas Hargreave, and she went through it in order, not sparing herself the parts that made her look foolish or the parts that made her look calculating, because neither of those things was the point. The point was that it had happened, and it had shaped the decision that had brought her to Wyoming, and he was going to hear a version of it from Edmund Frey, and she wanted him to have heard her version first. She told him about the article or the copy of one, and what she suspected about its origin. She told him about walking into the bank. She told him about everything Frey had said, including the offer, and what it would have required of her. She told him about Eula, about the cottonwoods, about the look on Frey's face when he understood she already knew. She did not tell him what to do about any of it. She was not there to tell him what to do. She was there to hand him what she knew and let him be the man she had decided he was. When she finished, the coffee in her cup was cold. Harlow's cup was on the counter beside him, and he had not touched it in a while either. He was looking at the middle distance, not at her in the way of someone whose eyes are pointing one direction while his mind is somewhere else entirely. After a moment, he said, "The letter, the one about Philadelphia." "From Frey," she said. "I believe so. No return address. He would know better than to sign his name to it." Harlow picked up his cup and looked into it. "I received it 3 days ago," he said. She was quiet. "I didn't ask you about it," he said. "I should have. You were deciding what you thought." "I was." He set the cup back down. "I've been watching you for 3 days to see whether you were going to say something on your own." He paused. "You were going to. I could tell last night you were working up to it." "I lost my nerve last night," she said. "I know." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "You found it this morning." He pushed off the counter and walked to the kitchen table and sat down. He put his hands flat on the table in front of him the way he did when he was working something out. It was the gesture of a man laying out the pieces of a problem so he could see them all at once. "The North Parcel," he said. "You know about the agreement with Caldwell." "Frey told me there was a debt situation. He didn't tell me about any agreement." "There's an agreement." He looked at his hands. "Caldwell owed me a sum of money. When he died, he couldn't pay it back. We had an arrangement in writing that said the North Parcel would come to me instead. I haven't filed it with the county yet." He paused. "I didn't file it because Caldwell asked me not to, and Caldwell's dead. And somewhere in my reasoning, I decided that still counted." She looked at him. "It's a valid agreement. It should be. I had 2 witnesses." He thought. "Whether it holds against whatever Frey might argue, is a question for someone with more legal understanding than I have." "Then you need someone with legal understanding," she said. "I need several things," he said. He looked up at her. "I need to know whether you're staying." The question was plain. She gave it a plain answer. "Yes," she said. "I didn't come 1,500 miles to leave when it got complicated." He nodded. It was not a small nod. It was the nod of a man accepting something he had needed to hear. Confirmed something he had been carrying as an uncertainty that was now resolved. He stood up. "I need to talk to Dex," he said. He found Dex in the South Corral, working with a young horse that was not yet comfortable with the saddle. Harlow watched from the fence rail for a minute before he spoke because he wanted to look at the boy, the young man with fresh eyes, the way he had been looking at other things lately. Dex had his back to him. He was moving slowly around the horse, keeping his voice low and even, giving the animal time to understand that nothing being asked of it was unreasonable. He was good at this. He had always been good with horses and bad at people, which was a common enough combination. "Dex," Harlow said. The young man turned. He read something in Harlow's expression, and the look on his own face shifted, became careful. He passed the lead rope to the post and came to the fence. Harlow said, "Frey said something to you about Cecily." It was not a question. Dex stood with his hands at his sides and was quiet for a beat too long. "He said he'd heard things," Dex said, "from back east. He said he thought you ought to make inquiries before things got official. And you didn't tell me. I didn't know what to make of it. When you don't know what to make of something, you tell me." Harlow's voice was even. It was not raised. The evenness of it was in some ways harder to hear than anger would have been. "That's what you do. You don't sit with it and let it change how you look at a person. You come to me and we figure out what it means together." Dex looked at the ground. His jaw was tight. "I know, B." "No," he said. "Frey knew that you come to me with things. He knew that about you and he used it." Harlow let that sit for a moment. "Not your fault that he knew, but you helped him by not asking questions. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." Harlow looked at him for a long moment. The young man before him was the same boy who had arrived at this ranch at 9 years old, with one shirt to his name, and the specific damaged wariness of a child who has learned that adults leave. Harlow had been trying for 15 years to teach him that the alternative existed. He was not done teaching. "Frey told you to doubt her," Harlow said. "Not because he knows anything worth knowing about her character. Because he wanted a wedge. Between her and me, between you and her, between all of us and whatever we might decide to do together." He waited. "You see it now." "Yes, sir." Dex's voice was lower than usual. "There's something else you need to know." Harlow laid out what he had found at the north boundary, the stakes, the survey. He explained the agreement with Caldwell, the debt, the creek, what Frey had tried to do through Cecily. He told it straight through without editorializing the way he always told things, because he believed that the facts of a thing laid out cleanly were usually indicting enough without embellishment. When he finished, Dex was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" "File the Caldwell agreement with the county," Harlow said, "today, and then go to the bank." "Do you need me to?" "I need you to apologize to Cecily." Harlow pushed off the fence. "Properly." Not because I'm telling you to, because it's what's right and you know it. He started toward the house, then stopped and turned back. And Dex, next time someone tells you something about a person that makes you look at them different, you go to that person first, before you look different at them. That's how it works. Dex nodded. He stood there with his hat in his hands, and his jaw still tight, and Harlow could see him turning it over the whole shape of what had happened, and what his part in it had been. That was a necessary thing. A man who didn't turn it over wouldn't learn anything from it. "I'll go in and talk to her now," Dex said. "Good," Harlow said and went inside. Cecily was in the kitchen when Harlow came back through and said he was gonna town. He said it plainly. He was taking the Caldwell agreement to the county recorder's satellite office, which kept a clerk in Colton 2 days a week for exactly this kind of business. After that, he was going to the bank. She said, "I want to come." He looked at her. She said, "He made his offer to both of us in different rooms. I'd like to be in the same room when we answer it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." They drove in together in the wagon. The morning was cool and bright. The kind of Wyoming morning that makes the country look generous, all open sky and good light on the hills. Cecily sat with her hands in her lap and did not speak much, and Harlow drove with the reins loose in the way of a man who knows every rut in the road and does not need to manage them consciously. At the dry goods store, she waited on the boardwalk while he went into the small office the county kept in the back room. She watched the street. It was a Tuesday, which meant moderate traffic. A few wagons, a woman with a basket moving between the church and the boarding house. 2 men loading timber outside the hardware building. Colton going about its business, ordinary and unhurried, entirely unaware of what was about to be settled in its midst. Harlow came out 11 minutes later. "Filed," he said. She said, "Then let's go." The bank was cool inside the way stone buildings stay cool in the mornings before the day has had time to work on them. The teller looked up. Harlow said they were there to see Mr. Frey. The teller knocked on the inner office door. Frey opened it himself. He looked at Harlow first, and then at Cecily beside him. And in the fraction of a second before his expression composed itself into its customary arrangement of pleasant authority, she saw something pass through it. It was too controlled to be called surprise. But it was the adjustment a man makes when the situation he is in has turned out to be different from the situation he had prepared for. "Harlow," he said, "and Miss Vane, come in." They came in. Frey went behind his desk and remained standing. Harlow did not sit. He put a hand into the inside pocket of his coat and brought out a folded document and set it on the desk. "That's a copy," Harlow said. "The original is now filed with the county recorder." Frey looked at the document without picking it up. He would know what it was, or he would construct a good approximation of it within a few seconds of reading the first line. He read the first few lines. Then he straightened up and looked at Harlow. "This was never filed," he said. "It's filed now. The agreement predates. The agreement is dated October 1886 and witnessed by 2 individuals who are still living in this county and will affirm it," Harlow said. "The terms are plain. The north parcel transfers to me as settlement of the Caldwell debt. You can challenge it. You'd be asking a court to examine your loan records to do it." He paused. "That's your choice to make." The room was very quiet, Outside, the ordinary sounds of the street continued a wagon, a voice, the distant rhythm of a hammer somewhere down the block. Colton continuing without them. Frey set his hands flat on the desk. He was thinking. She could see him working through it, the methodical calculation of a man who has made a career of finding angles, looking for the exit from a position that was closing. His eyes moved to her briefly and then back to Harlow. "The dead on the south parcel remains," he said. It was a rear-guard action and he knew it. He was buying time to land somewhere. "It does," Harlow agreed. "I'll make payments on schedule as I have been. If you want to call it early, file the paperwork through the county." He let that stand alone for a moment. "Which means your records get examined." Frey said nothing. Cecily had not spoken since they entered the room. She spoke now because there was one thing that had not been said, and she wanted it said while they were all in the same place. She said, "The woman living in the storage house on the north parcel, Eula, she stays." Frey looked at her. "When the land transfers," she said, "she stays. That's not a question." Frey looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a man who has overestimated one thing and underestimated another, and is reckoning with both simultaneously. He had overestimated how much Cecily Vane would value her own safety over the chance to do the right thing. He had underestimated the effect of those 4 words on a March evening, whatever came with her, written by a man who apparently meant them completely. He had built his entire architecture on the assumption that the 2 people in front of him would not talk to each other before he had shaped what they knew. He had been wrong by a matter of days, perhaps less. He sat down. He picked up his pen and set it down again. He looked at the copy of the Caldwell agreement on his desk. "You'll want to review the deed paperwork," he said. His voice was level. It was the voice of a man who has chosen his ground and intends to maintain what dignity is available to him on it. "I'll have my clerk prepare the transfer documentation." Harlow said, "We'll come back Thursday for it." "Thursday," Frey agreed. They left. On the boardwalk outside, the morning light had shifted into its full midday clarity, the kind that leaves nothing soft or ambiguous. The street was warmer than when they had gone in. Cecily stood for a moment with her face turned toward the sun, which she did not do as a gesture, but simply because the sun was there and the warmth of it was useful. Harlow stood beside her. He was looking at the street. He had the look of a man who has completed something large and is not quite sure yet what the completion feels like. Like a fence job that has taken all season, you drive the last post and stand back, and the relief and the satisfaction are there. But they are quieter than you expected, because the work was so consuming that the ending is almost strange. He said, "There's something I should have told you when you arrived." She waited. "The north parcel has a debt against it. I didn't tell you because I didn't know yet how to tell it." He was looking at the street, not at her. "Not because I was hiding it, because I hadn't decided what the right words were." She said, "I know you weren't hiding it. You couldn't have known that for certain." "No," she said. "But I decided to assume it and keep watching." He turned and looked at her. And I've been watching for 3 weeks, and it still seems like the right assumption." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I found the survey stakes on the north boundary 10 days ago. Before Neil came. I should have told you about those too." She nodded. That's when you went quiet. Yes. All right, she said. We're telling each other things now. He almost smiled. It was the same near smile she had seen in the kitchen that morning, the expression of a man for whom smiling does not come quickly or lightly, which meant that when it arrived in whatever form it chose to arrive, it was worth more than the full version on someone else's face. They walked to where the wagon was tied. On the way home, somewhere on the 2nd mile of the 7, Harlow said, "Eula, she's living on your land," Cecily said. "You knew that. I've known for 4 years. What are you going to do with it now that it's formally yours?" He thought about this for a time, in the way he thought about things without rushing the answer. "Nothing different. She stays. We'll get it on paper this time, something recorded." He paused. "She won't like the paperwork. She doesn't like owing anything to anybody." "She doesn't have to think of it as owing," Cecily said. "She can think of it as being recognized. There's a difference." He glanced at her. "You'd know how to explain that to her." "Probably better than you would," she said without cruelty. "You're better at doing right by people than explaining to them that you're doing it." He did not argue this point. They rode the rest of the way mostly in silence, not the silence of two people who have nothing to say, but the silence of two people who have said what mattered and do not feel the need to cover it over with noise. The hills move past on either side in their late-season colors, brown and gold, and the dark green of the creekside vegetation. And the sky above them was the shade of blue that seems to deepen as afternoon moves toward evening. Briggs Ranch came into view on the rise, the same way it had come into view on that first morning, the house, the outbuildings, the long line of the south fence. It looked as it always did from this angle, like a place that had been built to last. Not beautiful exactly, but built with the kind of intention that outlasts aesthetics. Dex was on the porch when they pulled in. He came down the steps when Cecily climbed from the wagon, and he stood in front of her with his hat in his hands, in the manner of a young man who has been composing something for a while and is now committed to delivering it. He said, "I'm sorry, Miss Vane. I let someone put doubt in me about you without asking you anything myself. That was wrong." She looked at him for a moment. He was 24, and he was trying, which was more than many people managed at twice that age. She said, "I accept that. Thank you for saying it plainly." He nodded and put his hat back on and went to help Harlow with the horses, which was the way of young men who have done what needed doing and are grateful to have something physical to return to. Cecily went inside. 3 things happened over the following weeks in the order they happened. The clerk at First Territorial Bank let it be known in the particular way that information moves through small towns, through tone, rather than statement, through what is not denied rather than what is confirmed, that there had been a change in the status of certain land arrangements in the northern part of the county. Colton was the kind of town that understood the implications of this without needing the details spelled out. Edmund Frey's name appeared in fewer conversations about future plans. His name in connection with the words "the bank" still appeared. But the confidence with which it had previously been attached to the idea of growth and influence had changed quality. Nothing dramatic. Just a subtraction of certainty that people registered without necessarily naming. The second thing was that Harlow drove out to the North Parcel storage house on a Wednesday with Cecily beside him and a document from the county recorder in his coat. Eula met them on the step with the expression of a woman who has had a long time to prepare for bad news and has made her arrangements accordingly. Harlow told her the land was now his and showed her the document and told her she was staying and showed her a second document that said so. Eula read both documents slowly. She was not a fast reader, but she was a careful one. When she was done, she held them out to give them back, and Harlow said they were her copies for her to keep. She held them against her chest. She did not say thank you. She was a woman who had been shaped by years of needing things from people, and she had built herself a kind of pride that did not bend easily toward gratitude, even when gratitude was what she felt. What she said instead was addressed to neither of them in particular, and both of them at once. She had something, Eula said. She was looking at Cecily, but she meant it in a wider way. A way of making people feel they weren't in the way. Cecily said, "I'll take that." Eula said, "I wasn't giving you a compliment on your account. I was observing something true. But there was something at the edges of it that was not entirely without warmth." And Harlow stood to one side and did not say anything, because some things did not need to be spoken into. They drove back in the late afternoon. Cecily thought about what Eula had said and about what Harlow had not said in the moment after, and about the way the late light came across the cottonwoods at the edge of the north parcel as they turned the wagon south toward home. She thought about it the way you think about a thing that fits before you have decided whether you are ready for it to fit. The third thing was that Edmund Frey closed First Territorial Bank in the middle of October. He did not announce it directly. He simply was not there one Monday morning, and the clerk told people who came to the door that the bank was undergoing changes in management. By Wednesday, there was a notice from an institution in Cheyenne indicating that they had assumed certain accounts and liabilities. By the following Monday, a man from that institution had arrived by train to begin a review. Nobody in Colton said much about this in public. In private, there was some conversation about what exactly had changed in the last month to bring this about. The prevailing understanding arrived at without any single person having to explain it directly was that when certain informal arrangements have been holding certain things in balance, and those arrangements are no longer available, the balance changes. As for Garth Neal, he had not been back to the ranch since July, which was the way of men who read a situation correctly the second time, even if they had not the first. Nobody in Colton heard much from him after that autumn, and nobody looked very hard. What no one could fully explain was the expression Edmund Frey had been wearing in the days before he left. 2 people reported seeing him at his office window in the mornings looking out at the street, his hands behind his back, his face arranged into something they could not quite name, not angry, not broken. Something more difficult than either of those, the look of a man who has understood the mechanism of what happened and cannot find fault in the understanding itself, only in the single miscalculation he made at the start, the one that opened the door for everything else. He had stood in that window and watched them come down the street, and he had not called out, and he had not reached for the bell on his desk, because there was nothing left at that point to reach for. He had built his entire plan on the assumption that the 2 people walking toward him would not have spoken to each other honestly before he had shaped what they knew. He had been wrong by a matter of days, perhaps less, and no amount of information gathered from no number of contacts in no number of cities had told him the one thing that mattered, that a man had written 4 words in March and meant them completely, and that a woman had read those words and decided to find out whether they were true. That was the answer to the question this story began with. That was what the people of Colton had not understood when they saw him standing there. Harlow and Cecily were married in late October, in Nora Hendry's parlor, with Nora and Aldous Reeve and Dex and Eula in attendance. The minister came from the church and said what needed to be said, and they said what needed to be said back, and it was over in less time than supper. Nora had made a cake that nobody had asked for, which she presented without sentiment, and which was excellent. Dex shook Harlow's hand, and then, after a pause, shook Cecily's too, which was not the usual gesture, but felt like the right one. Eula had driven in from the north parcel in her wagon, which she had not done for some months. She wore a clean dress and sat in the corner chair through the ceremony and ate cake afterward, and said that the cake was adequate, which from Eula was the equivalent of a standing ovation. In the evening, they drove back to the ranch. That night, after the house had settled into its usual sounds and Dex had gone to the bunkhouse, and the lamps were turned low, Cecily walked through the sitting room on her way to the kitchen. She stopped at the fireplace. The armchair was there as it had always been, the book on the seat. She stood and looked at it for a moment. The worn arms, the settled cushion, the patient quality of an object that has been waiting a long time for things to make sense again. She did not move the book. She did not sit in the chair. She went to the small side table that stood a foot away from it and set her own book there. The Dickens. The one she had read 3 times, the one she was not finished with yet. She set it spine up in the lamplight open to the page she was on. Then she went to the kitchen for water. When she came back through, Harlow was standing in the doorway of the sitting room. He was looking at the 2 books, the chair with its book, the side table with Cecily's. She watched him look at it. She did not explain it. She did not need to, and she knew he did not need her to. He stood there for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "You're reading Magwitch yet?" he said. "Almost to him," she said. He nodded. He went down the hall to the bedroom. She stood a moment longer in the sitting room in the lamplight, with the 2 books and the old chair, and the sound of the October wind working at the eaves. Then she followed him. The people of Colton would talk about that autumn for a while, the way people talk about seasons when something happened in them. They would mention the bank and the land deal and the man who had left without a forwarding address, and gradually the specifics would soften into the vaguer shape that events take when they have become part of a place's understanding of itself. What they would remember eventually was the simpler thing. A woman had come from the east, and a man with a ranch and a bad leg and a chair by the fire had gone to meet her at a train station, and whatever had been tested in the months that followed had held. That was the part that stayed the way things stay when they are true, in a way that does not require understanding all the details. The rest of it, the window, the man in it, the calculation he had made, and the place where it had failed, was the kind of thing that makes a story worth telling. But it is not the thing the story is about. The story is about 2 people who were both in their separate ways. People who had stopped expecting much, and who had found in the space of a few difficult months that the reason they had stopped expecting things was not because there was nothing left to find. It was because they had been looking in the wrong places. And what Frey had never understood, what no one who builds their architecture on fear and information and the weakness of people ever fully understands, is this: the moment 2 people decide to tell each other the truth before anyone else can tell it for them, there is nothing left to use. The lever has no place to rest. The whole machine goes still. He had known everything about them. He had known about Philadelphia, and the debt, and the creek, and the stakes in the ground. He had known the shape of what they were afraid of, and he had worked it carefully, and with patience the way a man works a thing he is certain he understands. What he had not known was that on a March evening in Wyoming, a man had sat at a kitchen table and written 4 words that he meant completely without knowing yet how much they would be required to hold. Whatever came with her. That was what he had not known. And it was, as it turned out, the only thing that mattered.